Thank you for viewing this presentation titled Gender Perception of Speech, Dependence on Format Space Configuration, Fundamental Frequency, and Source Spectral Tilt. First, an overview of the study. The objective was to investigate how listeners use elements of the acoustic signal to infer speaker gender. 210 sound files were synthesized such that each sound file was a unique combination of 10 values for fundamental frequency, 3 values for source spectral tilt, and 7 sets of values for format frequencies. Each sound file contained the vowels e, a, u in random orders. Participants judged the speaker as female or male. Findings showed that both fundamental frequency and format frequencies contributed to gender perception. The contribution of source spectral tilt was subtle. Background. Previous work has found that increasing the values for fundamental frequency or format frequencies increase the likelihood that a listener will perceive the speaker as female. However, there remains debate on the extent to which fundamental frequency or format frequencies drive gender perception. Some have argued that only fundamental frequency drives gender perception, whereas others have found unambiguous evidence that format frequencies do contribute to gender perception. More work is needed to determine how listeners respond to various combinations of values for fundamental frequency and format frequencies. Since the acoustic signal contains other elements beyond fundamental frequency and format frequencies, other elements warrant attention. This figure shows fundamental frequency on the vertical axis and format frequencies on the horizontal axis. For both, values can be categorized as male typical, gender ambiguous, or female typical. Early studies investigated the matched conditions where both fundamental frequency and format frequencies were either both female typical or both male typical, as shown by the green circles, or the mismatched combinations, as shown by the red circles. More recent work has considered the gender ambiguous combinations as well, as shown by the yellow ellipses. The present study investigates gender perception across the full range of values. All studies in the literature review have considered fundamental frequency and format frequencies, though some authors have considered other variables such as spectral level, defined as a combination of source spectral tilt and bandwidth. Hence, the present study further investigates source spectral tilt. This leads to the purpose of the present study. The present study independently varied fundamental frequency, source spectral tilt, and format frequencies, that is vocal tract length, in the novel context of format space configurations to determine the dependent listener perception of speaker gender as either female or male. Methodology. The values for variables. 10 values for fundamental frequency that ranged between the typical male value to the typical female value were used. 7 sets of values for format frequencies that ranged between the typical male value to the typical female value were used. All format frequencies for the vowels e, a, u were shifted concurrently based on calculated vocal tract length. 3 values for source spectral tilt that corresponded to the vocal qualities of pressed, normal, and breathy were used. The noise component for breathiness was not included. This is a schematic of a synthesized sound file. Each vowel, as shown by the green rectangles, is 250 milliseconds in duration. The program Madde was used to create each vowel. Brief silences, as shown by the blue rectangles, separate the vowels. The program Praat was used to combine the vowels and silences into a single sound file. The presentation of 4 vowels as a string rather than as isolated vowels defines the format space configuration as a context for investigation. You will now hear an example sound file where both fundamental frequency and format frequencies are male typical. You will then hear an example sound file where both fundamental frequency and format frequencies are female typical. The source spectral tilt is -14 dB per octave, a normal value for both files. Listeners used a custom program written in E'2 to listen to sound files and log responses. First, the screen was gray and a sound file was presented once. Then the screen turned white and repeated the same sound file until listeners pressed 1 for male or 3 for female. The screen turned black, prompting the listener to continue. This process repeated for the next sound file. Participants sat in a sound-treated booth and wore headphones. All participants spoke English as a first language, had no history of speech, language, or hearing disorders, and passed a standard hearing screening. Participants were recruited through a university platform. There were 14 female and 9 male participants. Results and discussion. 48 of the 210 sound files were repeated for all listeners. Reliability was defined as responding female-female or male-male for the 2 presentations of the same sound file. The average reliability was 80%. Generalized linear mixed model analysis was conducted to predict the likelihood that listeners would perceive the speaker as female given a combination of values for fundamental frequency, vocal tract length, and source spectral tilt. The LME4 package in R was used for analysis and alpha was set to 0.05. The model used vocal tract length as a stand-in single value that represented each set of values for format frequencies. We will now review the 2 significant main effects and then the 2 significant interactions. Both main effects are displayed. The vertical axis is the probability that a listener will perceive the speaker of the combination as female. The horizontal axis on the left-hand figure is fundamental frequency, and the horizontal axis on the right-hand figure is vocal tract length. The probability that a listener would perceive the speaker as female increased as fundamental frequency increased, and decreased as vocal tract length increased. These main effects are consistent with all reviewed studies. It is clear from the 2 main effect curves that there is a gradual shift from a majority perception of male to a majority perception of female. This suggests that gender perception follows a continuum rather than a binary distinction. The key contribution of the present study with respect to its findings lies in the interactions. The vertical axis is the probability that a listener will perceive the speaker as female. The horizontal axis is vocal tract length. The parameter is source spectral tilt. Negative 18 dB per octave corresponds to the vocal quality of breathy, and negative 10 dB per octave corresponds to the vocal quality of pressed. As vocal tract length decreases, there is a significant difference in the change in likelihood across the parameters. There is no difference among the values for the parameter for a long vocal tract, but there is a difference for a short vocal tract. The vertical axis is the probability that a listener will perceive the speaker as female. The horizontal axis is vocal tract length. The parameter is fundamental frequency. Rather than display all 10 values for fundamental frequency, the lowest, middle, and highest values were averaged and displayed. As vocal tract length decreases, there is a significant difference in the change in likelihood across values for fundamental frequency. The greatest change in likelihood across values for fundamental frequency occurred for the shortest vocal tract lengths. One observation about the dataset remains to be made. We observed that listeners were predisposed to respond male. We expected listeners to respond female 50% of the time, as shown by the black line. However, as the visible skewing of the data shows, listeners responded female 33% of the time. This predisposition has been observed intermittently in previous work. On the exit interview form of the present study, some listeners stated that they defaulted to male judgment in the case of gender ambiguity, but no listener reported defaulting to female judgment. It is beyond the scope of this study to account for this predisposition. Limitations and future directions. The present study is limited in 3 ways. First, in humans, increasing source spectral tilt corresponds with increases in aspiration noise. The present study lacks naturalness as source spectral tilt was increased without increasing aspiration noise. Future work may consider aspiration noise as a cue to speaker gender. Second, the format space configuration lacks ecological validity as a context as people do not speak in strings of vowels. Future work may consider investigation at the sentence level. Third, everyday gender perception is both an auditory and visual phenomenon, as listeners in the real world both see and hear the speaker. The present study considered only auditory stimuli. Future work may consider adding a visual variable, such as silhouettes. The silhouettes could be clearly male, gender ambiguous, or clearly female. Conclusions. There are 4 conclusions. First, fundamental frequency and format frequencies were found to be the main drivers of gender perception. Second, the contribution of source spectral tilt was found to be subtle and mediated by its interaction with format frequencies. Third, there was a predisposition to respond male. Fourth, gender perception was found to follow a continuum, not a binary distinction. The results of the present study support targeting fundamental frequency and format frequencies in feminizing, neutralizing, or masculinizing communication therapy. Increasing either fundamental frequency or format frequencies increased likelihood of being perceived as female. Increasing both fundamental frequency and format frequencies resulted in a greater likelihood of being perceived as female than increasing only fundamental frequency or only format frequencies. The interaction between fundamental frequency and vocal tract length suggests that people who have shorter vocal tracts will benefit more from intervention to increase fundamental frequency than people who have longer vocal tracts. This concludes this presentation. Thank you for your time and attention. Please direct your correspondence to TJ Neuhaus at tjneuha@bgsu.edu. Thank you.